many years of mishandling of the Middle East, let's put it very mildly, by the West. I mean, Hezbollah would never have happened. It would never have existed if Israel had not brutally invaded Lebanon in 1982. And then the Iranians supported them and funded them. Now, do you consider Hezbollah to be terrorists? Well, if you come from the Israeli side, yes. If you come from the Shiite population of South Lebanon, you consider them to be a lifeline.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So this one right here is a conversation I have been wanting to break down for a while. You have got Piers Morgan sitting across from Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister and economics professor, and they are going at it over some of the biggest questions surrounding the conflict in the Middle East. We are talking about whether foreign powers have any moral authority to reshape an entire region, the massive double standard on nuclear weapons that nobody wants to address, and whether the word terrorist even means what people think it means. Yanis came with historical receipts and personal experience that Piers genuinely did not seem ready for. I am telling you right now, the further this conversation goes, the more intense it gets. So make sure you stay for the whole thing because the final exchange is something else. Entirely. Also drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you are tuning in from. I always love seeing how far this community reaches. All right, let us get right into it.
The second question people say is it important, do you think, that a theocratic fundamentalist Iran isn't allowed to have a nuclear weapon for the sake of the region and the world?
Well, look, I am a very fierce opponent of nuclear weapons. I was, back in the time when I lived in Britain, I was a paid-up member of CND. So I'm never going to support anyone's right to own or to develop a nuclear weapon. But we live in a world where, the West is so complicit and so duplicitous. On the one hand, you have Israel that has violated every nuclear proliferation or anti-proliferation treaty there is. Nobody's talking about the nuclear weapons that Israel has.
Well, they don't even admit having them, do they?
Indeed. So they've broken every rule and regulation. Nobody's talking about it. Now, Piers, I don't think that Iran wants to develop a nuclear weapon. I mean, the previous Khamenei, the elder, the late Khamenei, I should say, took out a fatwa. I believe it was genuine. My understanding of what the Iranian government wants is they want to maintain their sovereign right to enrich uranium so that, if needs be, they can have a bomb. But they don't want to have a bomb because they've seen what happened.
But isn't that a large leap of faith, though, in a regime which, I mean, at best, this is a regime, it may well be a functioning regime, but it's unbelievably repressive to its own people. I think it's undeniable that it has funded and provided arms to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Hamas over the last 2 decades more. This is a very unpleasant regime which has promoted terrorism around the world and terrorized its own people. I mean, let's not get too ahead of ourselves, surely, in sort of saying, well, actually, they're not that bad, so therefore we should trust them about the enriched uranium, which they're enriching at quite a rate. We should trust them about other areas of how they go about their business. Should we?
Well, let me answer in 2 points, with 2 points. The first one is you should never trust anyone, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. We should trust and verify. But I remember the short stint I had in government, I also had the honor of having a brief discussion with Barack Obama in the White House. And this was in April 2015. I wanted to talk to him about Greece's debt disaster and our awful economic crisis. He didn't want to talk to me about that. He wanted to talk to me about how proud he was of his deal with Iran and with the European Union. Because that deal, you will recall, included extremely arduous verification processes. All the Iranian facilities would have been open for inspection by international inspectors. There would be cameras, there would be sensors, there would be everything that is necessary in order to trust and verify. So that's the first part of the question. Ironically, isn't it terribly ironic that if you think about it, the best that Donald Trump can get now is something like that agreement that Obama had already struck with the Iranians and the Europeans, and the Germans were really very, very gung-ho about it, including Angela Merkel, the chancellor at the time. and which then Donald Trump, the moment he was elected, not because he had any strong opinions about this, he just wanted to bring down anything that Obama had done, and it was a direct request by Israel.
This is where the whole argument collapses, because Piers asks whether Iran should be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, and Yanis does something brilliant. He does not take the bait. He says, I am against all nuclear weapons. But then he flips the entire framing. He says the West is so complicit and so duplicitous. And here is where it gets uncomfortable, because he points out that there is a country in that same region that has violated every nuclear non-proliferation treaty in existence. Every single one. And nobody says a word, no sanctions, no enforcement, nothing. And you know what makes this moment even more powerful? Piers himself confirms it on air. He goes, well, they do not even admit having them, do they? The host of the show just validated the double standard in real time. Think about what that means. The country that actually has the weapons, that refuses inspections, that will not sign any treaty gets absolutely zero pressure. But the country that has not built a weapon and even had a religious ruling against building one is the one getting bombed. And then Yanis brings up something most people forgot. There was already a deal. A sitting world leader negotiated directly with Iran and the European Union. It included cameras in every facility, international inspectors with full access, sensors everywhere, real verification, it was working. And then a new administration came in and tore the whole thing apart. Not because Iran broke anything, not because the deal failed, purely because the previous leader built it. Yanis himself sat in the White House and heard firsthand how proud that leader was of what was accomplished. And the most painful part? The best possible outcome right now would be getting back to that same agreement. So everything got destabilized and billions got spent to end up exactly where things started. That is not strength. That is the most expensive ego trip in modern foreign policy.
But the second thing I want to say, allow me, I need to say that Iran is the only country that has not invaded any of its neighbors. It was invaded brutally by Iraq. That invasion saw 600,000 people die in Iran. Chemical weapons were used with the acknowledgement of support or, turning a blind eye of the West. The Houthis, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, partisans, guerrillas, call them terrorists, call them whatever you want. I don't call them terrorists. That Iran did support, where they are, how shall I put it? They are movements that sprang out of many years of mishandling of the Middle East, let's put it very mildly, by the West. I mean, Hezbollah would never have happened. It would never have existed if Israel had not brutally invaded Lebanon in 1982. And then the Iranians supported them and funded them. Now, do you consider Hezbollah to be terrorists? Well, if you come from the Israeli side, yes. If you come from the Shiite population of South Lebanon, you consider them to be a lifeline. So, let's be nuanced about that.
But when you say, but Yanis, when you say that Hamas are not terrorists, I mean, what we all witnessed on October the 7th was 3,000 people charging over a border and committing heinous acts of terror against any civilians they could get their hands on. And some military, but predominantly civilians. They were kidnapping babies, they kidnapped Holocaust survivors, they slaughtered young people at a music festival, they were bombing, setting fire to things, and so on. This is surely the most blatant act of terrorism imaginable. Why would you not categorize Hamas, at the very least post-October 7th, as terrorists?
I consider those to be hideous and heinous war crimes. And there's no two way about that.
But why not terrorism?
Well, because you see, I have a problem with terrorism because, the IRA used to be terrorist until we had the Good Friday Agreement. And then they became partners in peace. Nelson Mandela was admonished as a terrorist when I lived in England. Margaret Thatcher, I remember calling him a terrorist. And then he became one of the greatest statesmen in the world. So I have a problem with the word terror because you see the whole point about the hideousness of human endeavors when it comes to defeating one another is to terrorize one another.
And then Yanis says something that should honestly be the headline of this entire conversation. He says Iran is the only country that has not invaded any of its neighbors. Let that sit for a second, because that is a fact that gets buried under every single talking point about the region. Iran has never crossed a border to attack another nation. Meanwhile, it was invaded, brutally. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. Chemical weapons were used against them. And what did the Western powers do? They looked the other way. Some of them actively supported the other side. And now those same governments point the finger at Iran and call them the threat. The double standard is unreal. And then Piers tries to pin Yanis on the groups that Iran has supported over the years. And Yanis does not flinch. He says, call them terrorists. Call them whatever you want. I do not call them terrorists. And before you react to that, listen to why. Because he explains that these movements did not appear from thin air. They grew out of decades of Western interference and mishandling of the entire region. He says one of the most well-known groups in Lebanon would never have existed if a certain country had not invaded Lebanon back in 1982. That is not opinion. That is documented history. And then comes the moment that silenced a lot of people watching. He brings up Nelson Mandela. He says Margaret Thatcher called Mandela a terrorist. The same man the entire world now celebrates as one of the greatest leaders in modern history. And here is what people need to understand. In 1988, the United States government officially placed Mandela and his organization on a terrorism watch list. He could not freely travel to the US until 2008 when that designation was finally removed. 20 years after he was already a global symbol of peace. So the word terrorist has never been a permanent truth. It is a political label that shifts depending on who holds power. And Yanis understood that better than anyone on that stage.
So I do believe in international law. International law is very clear. What happened, what you described, were war crimes. And I have no problem condemning them as war crimes. What I do not condemn, however, is an attempt by anyone, not just Palestinians, but by anyone, to escape an illegal fence around the open-air prison concentration camp that has been erected in order to deny them the human dignity. The whole existence of Gaza is not a country. Remember that. When they say, I remember when everybody was talking about the war between Israel and Gaza. Gaza is not a country. It was an open prison camp or a concentration camp that was effectively utilized in order to propagate ethnic cleansing and a slow genocide. So, of course, these are extremely delicate distinctions to make, but they're very important distinctions to make. I recognize the right of Ukrainians to kill Russians when Russians are invading Ukraine, right? I do not recognize the right of Ukrainians to kill Russian civilians intentionally. So we have to stick to the great success of the human spirit in 1945 of introducing international law, whereby we have very clear definitions of what is allowed in war. When is a people allowed to rebel against their incarceration, their ethnic cleansing, their abolition from the face of the earth? When is a war crime turning into genocide? Remarkable scholars, and most of them Jewish, did a lot of great work defining those limits, and we have to that has it.
The third question people raise is, now the war is at the stage it's at, a month in, is it not essential for the future of the region, of the wider world, that Israel and the United States win that war? What do you say to people that argue that? In other words, the lesser of two evils.
Well, I'm sorry, that's the greatest of the two evils. Here you have an unlawful war started by Israel and by the United States. It's a criminal war. Anybody who tells me that the right solution to that is for the United States and Israel to win is essentially telling me that they have no concern at all about international law, and they would like to see the violators of international law be the victors. I can't see that.
And this is where Yanis takes the entire conversation to a level that I genuinely do not think Piers was prepared for. Because he starts describing the reality on the ground in a certain territory. And he says something that cuts through every piece of spin you have ever heard about this situation. He says it is not a country. It was an open prison camp, and that distinction matters. Because when the media frames something as a war between two sides, it implies two functioning governments, two armies, some kind of balance. But that was never the case. One side controls the borders, the airspace, the water, the electricity. The other side cannot leave. That is not a war. That is something entirely different. And Yanis does not stop there. He draws a parallel that forces you to check your own consistency. He says, I recognize the right of Ukrainians to defend themselves when their land is being invaded, but I do not support targeting civilians intentionally. And that framework has to apply everywhere. Not just where it is politically comfortable. That is what international law was designed to be. Universal. Not a menu you pick from depending on which side you like. And then Piers asks the final question, and honestly it is the one that tells you everything. He asks, is it not essential that a certain superpower and its closest ally win this conflict? And Yanis does not hesitate for a single second. He calls it the greatest of the two evils. He says it is a criminal conflict. and that anyone who argues the violators of international law should win is essentially admitting they have zero concern for the rules they claim to defend. And I need you to sit with that, because that is not some fringe position. That is literally the foundation of the international system that Western nations built after 1945. You cannot champion a rules-based order and then cheer when your side breaks every rule. You cannot talk about sovereignty and then applaud the governments that ignored every diplomatic path available. What Yanis laid out was a framework that does not change based on who you support. The rules either apply to everyone or they protect no one. And the fact that Piers could not land a single effective counter across this entire segment tells you exactly how airtight that argument was. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.